I grew up in a dying town in West Virginia, the kind of place that doesn't show up on most maps anymore, where the coal dried up decades before I was born and took the life with it. Main Street ran through the center like a crooked spine, lined with brick storefronts that hadn't seen customers since my grandmother was young. Most of the windows were boarded over with plywood that had gone gray and soft with rot, and the few that weren't just showed empty rooms beyond the glass, dark even in daylight, like looking into the eye sockets of something long dead. The town had maybe 300 people left when I was 17, most of them old enough to remember when the mines were running, when the trains came through twice a day instead of once a week, when you could walk Main Street at night without feeling like you were trespassing in a graveyard. My parents had left when I was 14, packed up and moved to Morgantown for work, but I stayed with my grandmother in the house she'd lived in since 1952. She needed someone and I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The mountains had a way of holding on to you, roots going deeper than you realized until you tried to pull away. I worked nights at Shirley's Diner, the only place in town still open past 6 o'clock, serving coffee and pie to truckers who took the back roads to avoid the interstate tolls and the handful of locals who couldn't stand eating alone in their empty houses. The work was mindless, the tips were terrible, but it kept me busy, kept me from thinking too much about the silence that settled over everything once the sun went down. Shirley was 60-something, skin like leather from years of smoking, and she paid me under the table because the diner barely made enough to keep the lights on, let alone payroll taxes. It was late October when it started, that brief window between the leaves turning and the first hard frost, when the air gets sharp enough to sting your lungs and the dark comes early, pressing down like a weight. I'd closed up the diner just after 11, same as always, locked the door behind me and started the walk home. It wasn't far, maybe 8 blocks, straight down Main Street and then left onto Maple where my grandmother's house sat at the end of a row of identical post-war boxes, hers the only one with lights still burning. The fog had rolled in from the river that night, thick and low, moving through the streets like something alive, curling around the lamp posts and filling the spaces between buildings with a pale, gray presence that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The streetlights along Main were old, the kind with yellow bulbs that buzzed and flickered, and half of them had burned out years ago without being replaced. The ones that still worked cast these weak pools of sickly light that barely pushed back the darkness, and walking between them felt like moving through a series of connected caves, brief moments of visibility separated by stretches of near-total black. I'd made this walk 100 times, maybe more, and I'd never felt afraid before. Uneasy, sometimes, in that way you do when you're alone at night in a place that feels abandoned but not afraid. Not like that night. I was 2 blocks from the diner when I first heard them. Footsteps. Soft and shuffling like someone wearing old boots on the cracked concrete, the sound echoing slightly in the empty street. They were behind me, matching my pace, starting when I started, stopping when I stopped. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own steps, the sound bouncing off the buildings in some strange way, but there was something wrong with the rhythm. They came just a half second after mine, like someone was deliberately walking out of sync, mimicking my movements but not quite matching them. I turned around, heart already beating faster than it should have been, and swept my eyes down the empty street behind me. Nothing. Just fog and darkness and the dim outline of shuttered buildings. The nearest streetlight was half a block back, its yellow glow barely visible through the mist, and everything beyond it was just shapes and shadows. I stood there for a long moment, listening, my breath coming out in pale clouds that mixed with the fog, and the only sound was the wind rattling the metal shutters on the old hardware store, a dry scraping sound like fingernails on wood. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the wind or an echo or my imagination running wild after too many late nights and too many cups of bad coffee. I turned back around and kept walking, my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled between my shoulder blades like a cold hand. But the footsteps started again. Soft, deliberate just behind me. Closer than before. I walked faster, my own steps quickening, and the other steps matched me beat for beat, staying the same distance behind. I could hear them clearly now, the scuff of worn leather on concrete, the slight drag of a heel, and underneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite place, something like breathing but deeper, more like air moving through a narrow space. I didn't want to turn around again. Some part of me, the part that still listened to the old warnings my grandmother used to give me about the mountains and the things that lived in them, knew that turning around was the wrong thing to do. That acknowledging it would make it real. But I couldn't help myself. I stopped under one of the working street lights, the bulb buzzing overhead like a trapped wasp, and spun around fast, my hand already pulling the small flashlight I kept in my jacket pocket. The beam cut through the fog in a narrow cone, showing me the street behind me in harsh white light. Empty. Completely empty. But the dust on the sidewalk, the fine layer of grit that covered everything in a town where nothing moved anymore, looked disturbed. Faint impressions, almost like footprints, but fading even as I looked at them, the edges blurring and disappearing like someone was erasing them from the inside out. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my grip, and I swear I felt something. Not a touch, exactly, but a presence, a cold spot in the air just behind my right shoulder, close enough that if I reached back, I might have brushed against it. The temperature dropped, my breath coming out in thick clouds now, and I could smell something faint but unmistakable. Damp earth. Rotting leaves. The smell of something that had been buried and shouldn't have been disturbed. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I turned and I ran, my footsteps loud and panicked on the concrete, my breath ragged, and behind me I heard them again. Not running. Not hurrying. Just walking, steady and patient, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I went. The sound didn't fade. It didn't fall behind. It stayed right there, just out of sight, just close enough to let me know it was still there, still following. I made it to Maple Street, took the corner so fast I nearly slipped on the wet leaves that had collected against the curb, and I could see my grandmother's house at the end of the block, the porch light burning yellow in the fog like a beacon. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming, but I didn't slow down until I hit the front gate, my hands grabbing the cold metal and pushing it open with a shriek of rusted hinges. I stumbled up the 3 steps to the porch, fumbling in my pocket for my keys, my fingers so cold and clumsy I nearly dropped them. Behind me the footsteps stopped. Right at the gate. I could hear them, clear as anything, the final step settling on the sidewalk with a soft scuff, and then silence. Complete, total silence. Even the wind had stopped. I got the key in the lock on the 3rd try, twisted it hard enough to hurt my wrist, and shoved the door open, practically falling inside. I slammed it behind me through the deadbolt and stood there in the dark hallway, my back pressed against the wood, listening. My grandmother was asleep upstairs, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old clock in the kitchen and the creak of the furnace kicking on in the basement. I didn't move for a long time. Just stood there, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that stress and exhaustion and too many late nights had finally caught up with me and made me see things that weren't there. But then I heard it. A creak. The floorboards in the living room just on the other side of the wall from where I stood. Slow. Deliberate. The sound of weight shifting from one foot to the other. I peered through the gap in the curtains that covered the window next to the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the fabric aside. The porch was empty. The gate was closed. The street beyond was nothing but fog and darkness. But the floorboards creaked again, moving across the living room in the exact same pattern I just walked when I came in. From the door to the hallway. From the hallway toward the stairs. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with all the lights on, a knife from the drawer on the table in front of me, watching the doorway and listening to the house settle around me. The creaking stopped around 3 in the morning, just faded away like it had never been there, but I didn't trust it. Didn't trust the silence that followed. When dawn finally came, gray light creeping through the kitchen window, I felt like I could breathe again, but the relief was thin, fragile. I told my grandmother about it the next morning, expecting her to tell me I'd been dreaming, that old houses make noise and fog plays tricks on your eyes. But she just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, something between sadness and resignation, and she said, "You heard the walkers." I didn't know what that meant. She poured herself more coffee, her hands steady in a way mine hadn't been since the night before, and she told me about the people who'd wandered off over the years, the ones who'd gone into the mountains and never come back, or the ones who'd died alone in houses that no one checked on until the smell got bad enough that neighbors called the sheriff. She said the town had a way of holding on to them, that their footsteps stayed behind even after they were gone, walking the same paths they'd walked in life, looking for something they'd lost or maybe just too stubborn to leave. She said they followed people sometimes, especially people who were alone, people who walked the streets at night when the fog was thick and the boundaries between things got thin. She said they were harmless, mostly just echoes, but that you shouldn't acknowledge them, shouldn't let them know you could hear them, because if you did, they'd get closer. Keep trying. And sometimes if they got close enough, they'd follow you inside. I wanted to tell her she was crazy, that it was just a story, the kind of thing people in dying towns tell each other to make the emptiness feel less empty. But I couldn't. Because I'd felt it. That cold presence. That smell of earth and decay. And I'd heard those footsteps inside the house, walking the same path I'd walked, like something trying to remember how to be alive. I quit the diner 2 days later. Told Shirley I was moving to Morgantown to be with my parents, that my grandmother was getting too old to be on her own. It was a lie. My grandmother was fine. But I couldn't walk those streets at night anymore. Couldn't stand the thought of hearing those footsteps again, of feeling that cold breath on the back of my neck, of knowing that something was following me and I couldn't see it, couldn't stop it, couldn't do anything but keep walking and hope it didn't get close enough to touch. I moved 3 weeks later. My grandmother came with me reluctantly, leaving the house she'd lived in for more than 60 years. She never said it, but I think she understood. Some things you don't fight. Some things you just run from. But even now, years later, living in a city with streetlights that don't flicker and sidewalks crowded enough that you're never really alone, I still hear them sometimes. On quiet nights when I'm walking home from work, when the streets are empty and the air is cold, I'll hear footsteps behind me. Soft, shuffling. Just a beat out of sync with my own. And I don't turn around. I don't acknowledge them. I just walk faster, my hands shoved in my pockets, my breath coming out in pale clouds, and I tell myself it's nothing. Just an echo. Just my imagination. But I know better. I know what follows me. And I know that one day the dark will get deep enough, the fog will get thick enough, and those footsteps will finally catch up. They always do in the end. That's what my grandmother told me before she died last winter. She said the walkers are patient. They don't give up. They just wait. And when you're tired enough, lonely enough, worn down enough, they'll be there. One step behind. Waiting for you to stop running. I haven't stopped yet. But some nights, when I'm too tired to be afraid anymore, I wonder what would happen if I did. If I just turned around and looked. If I let them catch up. Part of me thinks I'd see nothing. Just empty air and my own reflection in a darkened window. But the other part, the part that still remembers that October night and the smell of damp earth and the cold that settled on my skin like frost, knows better. Knows that if I turned around, I'd see something I couldn't unsee. Something that's been following me all this time, getting closer with every ignored glance. Every night I pretend I don't hear them. So I keep walking. Keep moving. And I try not to listen too closely when the footsteps start again. Because they always do. Always will. One step behind. Waiting in the dark.